Unfortunately, I have decided to talk about Batman. Well, I'm doing this instead of unpacking my house or literally any other project I could be doing right now. So I want to talk about the two different types of Batman that I usually see, and it's usually a pretty sharp divide between what you see in official canon material and what you see in a lot of fan circles. So most people are probably going to be familiar with the canon Batman, obviously. He's the one that's in most live action versions, the DC animated extended universe movies, in all current runs of the comics pretty much. He's the very stereotypically masculine type of person that is angry and seems to only feel anger and angst and maybe like a couple other emotions sometimes, but it's mostly just anger and angst. And then on the other hand, you have most of the fan interpretations that you would find in transformative spaces. So like drawing a line between like the types of fans that would curate content, which means like they collect all of the canon information and then kind of curate it, so to speak. So like they are here to preserve that content and to sort of preserve the legitimacy of it, like to just talk about it as it exists. Whereas you also have this transformative side of fandom where people will take what exists in canon and usually extrapolate on it or transform specific aspects of it to express something that they're not seeing in canon. And that version of Bruce Wayne tends to be like sort of a woke king, which is very charming. I definitely think he's really adorable. I'm probably going to include a clip here of myself reading out an Unpretty fic, because I think that the AO3 user Unpretty does probably the highest quality example of this and one of the most popular examples of what I'm talking about. Maybe you could give people tips to be successful, Danny suggested. Based on personal experience, you should try being born a white millionaire with a type A personality and a need for external validation that can never be satisfied because your parents are dead. I don't think most people can use that, Jesse said. I hope not. But yeah, a lot of fans will focus on this like very wholesome version of Bruce Wayne, and also at the same time, those people will usually embrace the silliness of Batman in a way that I find canon is very hesitant to do, because I guess that would be breaking the suspension of disbelief for their audience if they ever once acknowledge that a man dressed as a bat is silly. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that Batman seems to definitely he is a fantasy character. He exists to like embody the fantasies of the people that are consuming his media, rather than challenge them. For the people that are being marketed to in a lot of the canon content, they aren't really interested in seeing Batman work through his trauma or be nice to his kids. And I know that people are going to, if anyone watches this, they're probably going to be like, oh, let me drop all the examples from canon where he says a nice thing or hugs his children, as if those are definitely exceptions to the rule and not the overwhelming vast majority of Batman content that exists in canon. Most audience members, or at least the ones with disposable income, are most interested in seeing Batman punch stuff and not think too hard about some underlying assumptions. Like a lot of Batman content will like question what justice is or what justice should be, or the nature of being a vigilante or revenge or whatever, and like that's fine, but a lot of them don't really want to ask like what trauma is and what healing is, at least not in a way that's very challenging, because they can't have a version of Batman who doesn't want to fight anymore, which makes sense. But something that a lot of fanning content does is that it wants to imagine that you can have a lot of trauma and fight for something and not be consumed with negative emotions. I think that primarily, like, not only does Bruce transformative fans represent this idea of like hope after trauma and like the ability to like use your trauma to actually achieve a good thing and to like further love in the universe. But I think that a lot of people want to imagine Bruce as like the theoretical good dad that a lot of people don't have. They want to imagine him as like, I guess, woke, but like someone who's compassionate and someone who is trustworthy and attentive and just generally kind. And I guess that's just not a fantasy that a lot of other paying people are interested in exploring. The idea that Batman could just be like a nice person who has a really silly idea of how to help people. I think that the big twist of this discussion is that we have to acknowledge that the people who are currently creating content for Batman are in fact fans, and they are by nature transformative because they are creating new content. They are taking whatever existed in canon and extrapolating from it and creating new things. But they are legitimized by Warner Brothers and by other people who are stakeholders in the Batman property. And so even though this is like only one section of people who basically make fan content, their works are canonized. Whereas people like Unpretty and tons of other people that I could name that make really good Batman content that is thoughtful and emotionally compelling in a way that I never find most canon Batman media to be. And those people are not going to be legitimized by the corporation that currently owns Batman, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are certain people creating canon content. I think it's just worth acknowledging that Batman has technically been out of character ever for like the past 50 years. Bob Kane and Bill Finger no longer created Batman content. And so I think it's definitely worth asking like why it is that the people who got hired to make Batman are the ones that were able to do that. And like obviously there's going to be some continuity between the people who actually own the property and decide what types of things get made and who gets to make them. But this isn't like an argument that like all canon content is bad or things like that. I think that the takeaway from this discussion is that I would like to see more diversity of things in Batman canon. I definitely have expressed many times that I find Batman very uninteresting on his own, and I think that he's much better when he has at least one of his kids around, whether that's Robin or someone else. He's much more interesting as a parent than he is on his own. Other people have already talked about this, but I think that there are like very few women who have ever written for a main Batman book, and definitely not any that have written main Batman movies. So that's something that could definitely be improved. Because it's not as if like, I don't think that people really want to like cancel Batman. Like there's definitely a lot of people who like want to do their little hot takes and stuff and like, or just don't like him. But there's so many people that really like Batman. They just wish that like he had more going on for him and that the people who own him would take more risks and let him be different than the cash cow that they've had for the past 80 years, which of course isn't really going to happen. But I guess my main point is that Batman should be public domain because he's been around for a long ass time, and it would be really cool if there weren't this one very specific canon that everyone has to talk about. Like if we could talk about these other types of interpretations of Batman with equal legitimacy as Tom King or Zack Snyder's versions of Batman. Also, honorable mention to the Lego Batman movie, which by that very nature, it has to acknowledge how silly Batman is, which ultimately makes it a more emotionally convincing movie because they're not constantly trying to like baby the audience into believing that Batman is not a deeply silly character. And once you get past that hurdle, it's so much easier to engage with Batman content once you acknowledge that it's very silly. And then you can have a lot of cool stuff happen. And I wish that more cool stuff would happen